There is an interesting book, an interesting novel by a great novelist called Mario Vargas Llosa. And the book, I think in Spanish, is called Conversación en la Catedral. And on the first page of that book, he asks a question which goes as follows. At what moment exactly was it that Peru was fucked? But in many ways, Vargas Llosa, who politically is very far from where I stand, he's become quite right-wing, basically is proposing the fundamental political science questions about the breakdowns of democracy. Now, in most cases, when we're thinking about the breakdown of democracy, we're thinking about the sort of the traditional, if you like, Latin American coup, really. You've seen it in loads of movies. You have sort of Il Presidente, who sort of rolls in, and then you start sort of shelling the presidential palace, and then you have sort of a generalissimo who becomes the leader. That's sort of, you know, probably the Spanish approach, but in many other cases, that's the traditional breakdown of democracy. So whenever we're talking about populist leaders and the breakdown of democracy, we say, no, but that's not how it works, because we've all seen the American movies about breakdowns of democracies, and it's always they start marching on the palace, and then there's sort of gunfights in the streets, and in the end, the president is killed. Well, that was true in Chile in 1973. But generally, ladies and gentlemen, that is not how democracies break down. Democracies break down in ways that are much more subtle, in ways that obviously have evolved. There are ways of breaking down a democracy, but basically, fundamentally speaking, democracies, whenever they've existed, have broken down in exactly the same ways for the past, well, almost 2,500 years. Now, there was a man called Mussolini who was rather famous in Europe at some stage. He was, in many ways, of the Vargas Llosa kind of school of thought. Not that Vargas Llosa was a fascist, but Mussolini said very early on in his career, dismantling, and this is the quote here, dismantling democracy is like plucking a bird. You don't notice it until all the feathers are gone. So democracies break down not in the sort of coup-like generalissimo kind of fashion. They break down little by little what I, in a previous incarnation, have called death by 1,000 cuts. So it's sort of little by little you sort of pluck it away, and then gradually one day you wake up and democracy is gone. In other words, at what moment exactly was it that Peru was beep? So that is the same pattern. Now, you might sort of go back to Mussolini and say that he did it in a particular way, but it's also interesting that if you go back in Roman history, there's a great Roman historian called Tacitus. So this great man said about Augustus, Emperor Augustus, that he, quote, he gradually pushed ahead and absorbed the functions of the Senate and the officials. And again, gradually is the key word. He sort of did it little by little. Suetonius, now I'm really getting into my stride about the Latin teachers, but anyway, Suetonius, who was another great Roman historian, talked about how Augustus was doing these things. Now, it wasn't as if there weren't elections. And he was princeps, he wasn't the king or the emperor, because the Romans didn't want to have a king, because they liked to have a republic. So therefore he was just, you know, the first among equals. And of course there were elections, and when we read the Roman historian's accounts of it, he says that ballots were sealed, and they were sealed in containers from outside Rome, and then and this is a quote, so ballots were sealed, and in containers they were brought to Rome and counted in Rome on polling day. Which is, of course, how Emperor Augustus was a political genius. He did a very democratic thing. People would vote. They would have all the institutions were still in place, but of course the votes were counted in Rome, and they weren't necessarily with independent observers from the Jimmy Carter Institute, which wasn't established at the time. So therefore, because they were counted in Rome, interestingly, they all tended to vote in exactly the way that he had wanted. Now, there is a little story here about that, and you say, of course, I'm now not talking about Latin America, I'm talking about the other Latin guys, the Romans. So if you'd read Suetonius or Tacitus, then you would know how to break down a democracy, because the Romans had done that, and you know what to do and what not to do. And somebody like General Pinochet, it appears, was not a very good student. I'm sure that he had Latin at the military academy, but he did not learn the lesson that he had to count the votes centrally. He had studied rather too much economics. I think he was a freedman aficionado, and he wanted to save money. So when Pinochet had the referendum on whether he should stay in power forever, he thought, well, we should also save money, so let's count them locally, all these votes, because they're going to vote for me anyway, and I'm in charge of the military. And because they counted them locally, there were people who weren't quite unmessaged.
What I know is that Chilean people has already given their vote, and their vote is no to Pinochet, yes to democracy.
So if he had done like Augustus and transported all the votes to Santiago, then he probably would have won, because then he could have controlled the process. But he wasn't a good student. He hadn't read Augustus or Suetonius, and he didn't do that. Also, perhaps less surprising, he hadn't read Stalin. Stalin once famously said, in a democracy, what matters is not who votes, but who counts the votes. So Pinochet hadn't really done the 101 on dictatorship. And as a political scientist who's interested in the craft of politics, I'm all his other sins notwithstanding, I'm quite disappointed that Pinochet was such a poor dictator who at least didn't actually follow the procedures. But that's by the by. I'm hoping I'm not offending anyone.